Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Coach X Conversations, Coach X Live from the Institute of Coaching. My name is Jeff Hull. I am the Executive Director at the Institute of Coaching, and I am really excited to welcome you back today. So please start by saying hello in the comment section. We're looking forward to having a very lively conversation today with our dear guest, Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer, who is someone that we had a wonderful webinar with just about a week ago, and extremely provocative thought leader in the space of his new book called The 7 Rules of Power. Um, I was thrilled to have an opportunity to be in dialogue with Jeff, and we want to encourage you to go to the Institute of Coaching website where you can take a deeper dive into the webinar that he did for us, where he looked very deeply into the kind of research that led to this recent book. And so I'm very excited to have him back with us today. Let me start by giving you, those of you that are not familiar with Jeff, a little bit of his background. So Jeff Pfeffer is the Thomas D. Dee Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He's the author or co-author of over 16 books on topics including power in organizations, managing people, evidence-based management, and what he calls the knowing-doing gap. Many of you have probably heard of many of his books. One of my favorites, Leadership BS, he put out about a decade ago, and I often return to it because it's sort of a seminal read in the world of leadership development, and really looking at what is the behavioral research behind what works and what doesn't work when you're looking to so-called develop leaders. So Jeff received his PhD from Stanford. He's taught at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and the University of California, Berkeley, and returned to Stanford in 1979, has been a full professor ever since. Author of over 150 articles and book chapters, and has won numerous awards for his scholarly research, including an honorary doctorate from the Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And he's recently started a new podcast that we want to make sure that we shout out so that you'll take a extra minute and join. And I've already forgotten the name, Jeff, so tell me.
It's a simple name, Pfeffer on Power.
Pfeffer on Power. Couldn't be easier to remember, and I forgot it already.
It couldn't be easier to remember. And you can find it on Apple or Spotify or your favorite podcast, or you can just go to pfefferonpower.com and you can see the 3 episodes that we've released.
That's great. Well, I'm sure a lot of the folks here today will be doing exactly that. So I would just want to take a minute to welcome you all. I can see people coming in from all over. Wow. Hello from Miami, from Guatemala, from Paris, from Poland. Welcome. Vancouver, California, which is where you are, Jeff. So people will continue to come in, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. But I want to start by asking Jeff to give us a quick overview of, how he came to write this book, because this is a topic that is very much present in the media and certainly relevant for the times that we live in. But it's also his 16th book. So it's like, what prompted this one at this time? Love to have you comment on that. And then maybe give us a quick rundown on some of the key principles or the rules that you set up from your research. So welcome, and let's get started.
Sure. So I wrote the book because power remains, as Roosevelt Canner said in 1979, the organization's last dirty word. And particularly in the area of leadership development and oftentimes coaching, people shy away from the topic, which is unfortunate because many people, many executives suffer career derailments because they are ineffective in managing organizational dynamics. They need training in power and leadership, but they don't get it. And there's also this kind of myth that power has somehow changed in the era of social media. that the old rules don't apply, which is, by the way, there's no evidence for that. The powers disappeared, that we're in the era of new power or whatever, the end of power. None of that's true. So I decided to take this on directly and also try to use my experience in teaching both an online and on campus at Stanford version of this class to make the book shorter than the last one and better organized, so that people could get, right to the heart. And I like 7. There's 7 wonders of the world, or the 7 C's. 7 is the magic number. So
That's right.
there's 7 rules of power. The first rule, of course, is to get out of your own way, which is where I think coaching can really, really help people lose the scripts and the ideas and the beliefs that hold them back. Rule 2 is to break the rules. Rule 3 is to show up in a powerful fashion, to act and speak with power. Rule 4 is to build a powerful brand. Rule 5 is to network relentlessly. If leadership, management, call it what you will, is getting things done through other people, you can never know too many of those other people. You can never have too many allies or friends to help you accomplish what you want to accomplish. Rule 6 is to use your power. Power is not something that gets used up. The more you exercise your power, the more you use it, and therefore the more you are able to accomplish, the more power you will have. And rule 7, which may be the most controversial, but I think it's the most important. Rule 7 says that once you have power, money, success, and the 3 are not always completely correlated, but once you're in a position of power, people will forgive and forget what you did to get there.
And your research backs up that over the decades, these basic fundamental rules have not evolved. That what we see in today's world with the success of people in power is based on timeless fundamentals, correct?
That is absolutely correct. It's not my research, but it's the research in the social sciences, both sociology and social psychology. And it is timeless, I think, for some fundamental reasons. People are basically motivated to associate with, to be close to power. People are motivated, for their own, to get things done. The fundamental human motivations have not really changed since the opening scene of 2001, A Space Odyssey. I don't know if you remember that opening scene. It's pretty grim, but it also, I think, really reflects the reality of life. And people want to believe that the world is a just and fair place and that they don't have to, play the game. But that isn't true.
Yeah, and I think that what is particularly valuable for coaches in reading your book and learning about these principles, these rules, is that we in the coaching world probably have sometimes a rose-colored, perspective on what we are trying to accomplish or hope we can accomplish with our leaders. And yet the reality is that if they want to be effective, if they want to have an impact, they really need to be able to put these kinds of principles into action. And I love one of the stories that you share toward the end of the book about, I think it was an African-American woman who was in a very difficult situation with her boss and, turned to her coach, and the coach was very empathetic and very sympathetic and very supportive. And you basically say gave her the advice that you should fire your coach. And I love that because at the same time, you're also saying that coaches, as I know you use at Stanford in your program, the coaches have a powerful role to play, but it's important for them to be more than just empathetic and supportive and good listeners. They actually have to help their clients put these rules into effect so that they can have the impact that they would like to have in environments that are sometimes toxic and difficult. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because this is really important for coaches to hear.
Yeah, well, the story actually, it wasn't an African-American woman. It was a blonde
Oh,
engineer
I'm
from
sorry.
a
That's
blonde
fine.
engineer from MIT who had co-founded a company that was being sold to Google and got outmaneuvered and got basically taken out of the company by her co-founder and by somebody that they were trying to hire. And yes, and she went to her coach, and the coach said that these were sexist pigs, which I'm sure they were, and that they had treated her unfairly, which I'm sure was true. But I pointed out to her, and I point out to people all the time, that the only behavior you can control is your own. And that it's fine to say your boss or your co-founder behaved inappropriately, which he did, and that the guy that they were trying to hire into marketing and said he wouldn't work with her. I basically asked her a bunch of questions. The first question was, how do you know that this wasn't a maneuver of your co-founder to get you out? How do you know that the person who you were trying to hire, who your co-founder said would not work with you because you were a woman, how do you know that that was true? And by the way, would your co-founder have left the company under the same circumstances? And she looked at me and she said, you're blaming the victim. And I said, the only behavior you can control is your own. You cannot control what your co-founder is going to do. You cannot control what the people who you're trying to hire are going to do. So you need to be prepared to stand your ground and to not necessarily be the nice person who said, I'm going to get out of the way to make this company successful. And by the way, in the process, give away all your power. So at the end, we had an interesting conversation. and I think she left better prepared for the next time this happens. I mean, you cannot expect the people that you are working with, to necessarily treat you fairly or to necessarily look out for your interests. As I point out to people, Julius Caesar was killed by his best friend. The people who are going to take you out are most likely your co-founders, the people who you are close to, because they have both the opportunity and the motivation. You're not likely to get mugged by a stranger on the street. I mean, as we know, murders are most likely committed by somebody that you know. And this is true where we're talking about organizational, murders are like the real kind.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is for us to be realists in terms of what our clients are really up against in the real world. And if they really want to be change agents, they need to understand the dynamics of power, which haven't, as you said, changed much over 2,000 years. So I want to encourage folks, if you have questions, please throw them in the chat. This is an opportunity to ask those difficult questions. We have the expert in the house, so I'm very open to trying to get to as many as we can. So Pamela is asking for your thoughts on the difference between power and influence.
So power is the potential, and influence is power in action. And power, I would define power as the ability to overcome opposition, which is always almost inevitable in organizations. And that's because people have different information. They have different goals. They see the world differently. Where you stand depends upon where you sit. Engineering, marketing, finance are not all going to see the world the same way. Power is the ability to get your way in contested situations. It is the potential to get your way in contested situations. Influence is power in use.
I love that. Influence is power in use. That's well said. I'm curious I've been wanting to ask you this question since we did the webinar a little over a week ago, because I've been reflecting on our conversation. And I'm wondering if you think there's a difference or a distinction between power and leadership.
So John Gardner, the late cabinet secretary and the founder of Common Cause, said that power is an inextricable part of leadership. That to say leaders are preoccupied with power is to say that tennis players are preoccupied with making shots their opponents cannot return. That of course leaders are preoccupied with power. Power is a part of leadership. You cannot lead if you do not have power.
But you can lead. The issue that comes up for many coaches, I think, is that so many of your rules have been applied in situations where the outcome is potentially negative. So
power is a tool, and tools can be used in a variety of different ways. I have in 7 Rules of Power the example of Jim Jones, who nobody remembers anymore, but he is the guy who took 900 people down to Guyana and had them, in quotes, drink the Kool-Aid, commit mass suicide.
Right. I think we all remember it. We don't want to remember it.
No, many people actually, I find, don't remember it anymore because they're too young. But before he went down to Guyana, he was on the San Francisco Housing Commission. He was very much part of the San Francisco political establishment. And, I think he did, he used these, you can use the rules for bad, you can use the rules for good. But I'm not a moral philosopher. I try to teach people the tools. It is very much like teaching you how to use a a chainsaw or any other kind of construction tools. You know,
Right.
you if you're going to build a house, you need to learn how to use the tools, but you could build, good houses or bad houses or prisons or hospitals, or you can use the same tools for a variety of different purposes.
I'd love to have you expand a little bit on rule number 7, because folks always, even in the webinar, and I've already seen a couple comments in the chat here, they always have a bit of a gulp reaction to number 7. So say a little bit more about that one.
Well, it's true. It may be sad, but it is true. My favorite example, I mean, I have a billion examples, but one example, which I use in the book, is, of course, Lindsey Graham, who was a never Trumper until Trump got elected president. And then, his lips got firmly affixed to the various parts of Trump's anatomy. And in a New York Times article, where the author of the article, the New York Times reporter, is fascinated by Lindsey Graham's incredible transformation from, calling Trump all kinds of horrible names to saying, oh my God, I'm like his biggest supporter. And Lindsey Graham said, well, this is, of course, what I have to do because I want to be, and he uses a word which I love, relevant. And, I think I think you see this with people inside organizations, where various people become CEO or CMO or CXO or whatever the particular title is. And if you work for that person, you have two choices, basically to quit or to figure out how to build a positive relationship. So my friend Gary Lubman, who ran Caesars for many years and then went to Aetna and now is running a startup, has this lovely phrase, which is that critical relationships have to work. If Jeffrey Hull is on my critical path, and for whatever reason, I have come to the misapprehension that you are not a good person, or you're not a smart person, or you're not a competent person, or you're all of the above, as long as you are on my critical path, that relationship has to work. And I need to become much less judgmental, and I need to become much more pragmatic as long as you're in that job. And as long as your role is on the critical path that I have to traverse to get something done, I need to figure out how to make that relationship work. And it will not help me to make that relationship work to have all these judgments that you're a this or a that or the other thing. I mean, Mother Teresa says, if you judge people, you don't have time to love them. Walt Whitman says, be curious, not judgmental. All religions, basically all religions, teach non-judgment. Matthew 7, judge not that ye be not judged. Critical relationships have to work. So when you're in a position of power, I am probably going to forgive or forget what you did to get there. And there are a zillion examples of that. Right. Trump being a prominent one, but there are many others.
Yeah, so I'm noticing in the chat that there's a couple of comments and questions about about the gender perspective. And this came up in the webinar, and I didn't get a chance to ask you about it, but there's people that are sharing that they have a sense that this is a very male or patriarchal approach to power. And I wonder, given that there's many stories in your book about females in power.
And by the way, about African-American females.
Right.
Exactly.
So talk to that a little bit. Do you really, because people, they're asking, is this a gender-driven approach to power and leadership?
The short answer to that is no. This is a form, I would say that question represents a form of, the 4 stages of going through my class and the teaching. And the first stage is denial. This is a white male thing. This is an old thing. This is patriarchal. This is that, or the other thing. I have a coach who works with my class. He tells me that 70% of his clients are either women or people of color. The book is filled with examples of women and people of color. The podcast will be filled with women and people of color. The Pfeffer on Power podcast. We already have Deb Liu, an Asian American woman. The Ascend Foundation points out that the prejudice against Asians, women, is probably the highest level of prejudice, maybe even higher than for, African Americans, who knows, but Asian women face all kinds of career obstacles. Deb Liu is the episode number 1 for Pfeffer on Power. And she's written, actually motivated by her work with me in my class, has written her own book for women titled Take Back Your Power. So I can't cover, Take Back Your Power and what she talks about in her 20-minute podcast. But let me suggest that if you listen to her, I just did an interview with Rukiah Adams, who was asked to run for mayor of Portland, though she didn't. It was an African-American woman. There's absolutely no evidence that this stuff applies only to white guys. As a matter of fact, women and people of color need this material more. If you're a person of privilege, you don't need to know the rules of power. If I'm going to win the game anyway, the hell, I'm just going to sit back and win the game. It is the people who are in fact disadvantaged who need to understand power more and use it even more effectively.
Right. Absolutely. No, and I think that's where coaches need to be aware of the social science research that you share and some of the case studies that you share, because one of the things we can do as coaches is empower using these tools our clients. So yeah, well said. I'm really glad that we brought that up.
No,
Mark
it's exactly right. Because I get emails all the time from people of all different kinds and all different nationalities telling me how they have used this material to change their lives. And by the way, in my online class, within 8 weeks, this doesn't take, forever.
Yeah. I mean, as I read the book, I find those principles to be very fundamental, but I also love the way you break it apart into strategies and practices. I mean, maybe you can give an example of this, because one of my favorite sections in the book is on networking. And, this is an area where a lot of people will sort of resist, thinking, oh, handing out business cards, going to conferences. It's all about how many people you know and all of that. And what I love about what you share in the book is this very clear, specific strategies. So you want to say a little bit about that?
Well, last night I was at one of John Levy's influencers dinners. John Levy wrote a book called You're Invited. I would, recommend that people read the book You're Invited, or and there's a case study of John Levy in my book in the section on networking. And, we talk about how he has put together these dinners, which bring together all kinds of amazing human beings. And he has built a very successful living, not on the dinners themselves, but on the connections that he himself has made from the dinners.
Yeah, no, I think that it's one of the strategies that you point to in the book, which I think has been extremely helpful to me and sharing with clients, is to focus on the periphery. Those individuals.
The weak ties. Yep.
Yep, the weak ties. And you just never know how valuable someone that you didn't think was key, they're not your central stakeholders, which you spend all your time and your energy focusing on. They're actually can be crucial to having an access route or a step up into a new opportunity. So I think it's actually really helpful to know these research-based strategies. We're getting a good question about emotional intelligence. This is another topic I wanted to ask you about in the webinar. So I'm just curious because this has been, sort of a ubiquitous theme in the leadership development literature in the last few years. Where do you think developing or understanding the key elements of emotional intelligence fit into the keys for power?
Well, I think in order, so they tell you in every negotiation class I've ever seen that you need to negotiate over interests, not positions. And if I'm going to negotiate with interests, I need to be able to read the other individual. I need to know where that person is coming from. I need to know what's driving them. I need to know what's motivating them. I need to know what their key performance indicators are, how they see the world. So empathy, I think, is extraordinarily important if you're going to navigate your way through this. I mean, in order to be effective in influencing others, you first have to be able to put yourself in that other person's place.
But the irony is that many of the most powerful people that we have to sort of listen to and deal with on a day-to-day basis in our current world don't actually exhibit a great deal of empathy.
Well, they may know where people are coming from. It's just that knowing where people are coming from and acting on that knowledge are two different things. So I didn't notice I said I need to know where you're coming from. I don't necessarily need to take your interests into account.
Ah, interesting point. And would you say that the vast majority of the most successfully powerful people, they read the audience with their empathy or their intuitive or their listening, emotional intelligence skills, and then do whatever they need to do to move the needle. In other words, not necessarily responding to that.
I would say that that is right.
Yeah, so it's a kind of key distinction, right? That
Yeah.
they know how to use empathy or be aware and sensitized to what's going on with others, but not necessarily fall into the trap of becoming overly emotionally tied, because that will probably take away that might be actually disempowering.
That's probably right.
Yeah, interesting. So we're going to run out of time here, and I just want to give everybody a little chance if you have any last questions. Ethics. I knew this would come up. So Tom, thank you. Tom Horn is asking, please address the ethical use of power. What are your thoughts?
So I'm not an ethicist. I would say a few things about ethics. Everybody believes that we ought to teach ethics, in spite of the fact that there's no evidence that teaching people ethics actually makes them behave more ethically, because ethical behavior is much more situational than we think it is. And I think ethics, what is ethical to one human being is not necessarily ethical to another. And so I don't think anybody has anointed me, or for that matter, Tom, a king of the world. And I think I find it interesting that particularly my students and maybe coaches believe that they have the right to impose their value systems on other people. And I'm not sure who gave anybody those rights. You have your value systems, and you can certainly take those value systems into how you want to live your life and who you want to work for and what you want to do. But I'm not so sure you have either the right or, for that matter, the opportunity to impose that system on others. And I see I see with the coaches who I work with, and I do work with coaches in both the online, where I have 17 or 18, depending upon the quarter, and my on-campus class, where I have 6 experienced executive coaches who work with the class. I tell them to get the students to use the material and to use the concepts, and to use those concepts for what the students want to accomplish during our time together. And it's up to the students and the students' parents, maybe, and their loved ones to figure out what the objectives ought to be. But it's not up to the coaches to say, I think you ought to be CEO of this organization, or I think you got to go to work here or there. It is up to the coaches to help. So if you come to me, Jeff, and you say to me, I want your coaching, the first thing I'm going to say to you is, what are you trying to accomplish? And I'm not going to then say, no, that's the wrong thing. I think you ought to accomplish A, B, or C. My job is to make you as effective as possible in doing what you want to do.
So how do you feel about the books that are out now that are called purpose-led leadership, values-based leadership, servant leadership? I mean, are they aligned with your themes around power, or dissonant?
Mostly not. Mostly not. Well, first of all, as I say in the book Leadership BS, which is apparently one of your favorite books, a lot of the writing about leadership bears so little resemblance to reality. So Simon Sinek wrote this famous book, Leaders Eat Last. I don't know what data he's looked at, but he is writing this book as the discrepancy between what CEOs make and the frontline employees make has grown to gargantuan proportions. So leaders may eat last, maybe in the military, but leaders do not eat last in corporate America. Leaders eat first, second, third, and fourth. I mean, and there's data that indicates that. So, so we talk about servant leadership. Wonderful. We can also write about unicorns. I don't see it so frequently. So we need to, one of the things that most of these books do not ask about is base rates. How many servant leaders are there? How many leaders are actually, and you see this now. We first had the great resignation. Now we got the great layoff. There's a little blip in the economy and people are getting laid off. By the way, the leaders aren't getting laid off. It's the people who work for those leaders who are getting laid off.
So
people need to live in the world and look at what's going on in the world and stop writing these stories about, how they would love the world to be. If you're going to make the world the way you want it to be, you need to begin by understanding how and why it works the way it does. And you need to figure out how to make the world the way you want it to be and not live in some, world that bears no resemblance to the reality that we live in.
Yeah, no, I think that what's powerful about your work is it is kind of it may be a bit of a cold shower for some of us, but it's also a dose of reality based on research. So, I believe in trying to learn as many different perspectives as possible
Yeah.
and finding how they can be valuable for working with my clients. So, I do support my clients in getting in touch with their values and
Sure.
feeling a sense of passion and purpose. But at the same time, they're fooling themselves if they don't use the practices and the rules that are in the real world that you're pointing to in your book. So it's a both and kind of conversation.
Yep.
And with that, I know we're already over, and we're getting more and more questions. So we will follow up on LinkedIn with you. Jeff will hopefully follow up and answer some more of your questions. But I just want to take a moment to thank you, Jeff, for being our guest twice in the last couple of weeks. We really appreciate it at the Institute of Coaching. I think it's really valuable work. And I encourage you all to go to our website, instituteofcoaching.org, check out the video where there's a deeper dive into the principles in the book, and consider maybe joining the Institute of Coaching. We're always looking to build our community. And I just want to wish you all the best, Jeff. I think this is really important work that you're doing and bringing to the world.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being with you.
Thank you all. We'll see